at Data Driven Detroit. And as Alexis mentioned, there is a chat function, so feel free if you have any questions at any time to enter those into the chat, and we'll see if we have any time for questions afterwards. I also have a colleague who is helping me answer those questions, so we'll make sure you get the answers either during the webinar or after the webinar. But thanks for joining us. So today we're focusing on data ethics webinar. And let me get this going. So agenda for today is I'm just going to do a quick intro into D3 and then talk about data ethics in regards to research process and how data ethics can be a key element of your research process, even if you are creating your own research or using other people's research. And then we'll have some key question takeaways. So just to start out, those of you who aren't familiar with Data Driven Detroit, we are a local data intermediary in the city. What that really means is basically you can think of us as a data hub where we produce data, we consume data, we analyze data, and we provide it for Detroit residents, for nonprofits, for community development organizations, as well as philanthropy organizations. And our goal and our mission is to provide accessible, high quality information and analysis to drive informed decision making. So we understand that data is of value to many people who may not be able to access it. Either they don't have the means via technology, or they have data and information, they just don't know how to understand it. So we truly try and make data more accessible in those two ways. We were founded in 2008 began as a nonprofit and then ended up in 2015 converting to an L3C, which gives us a little bit more flexibility in how we accept projects, and we always do our projects as a mission-driven organization. And we are currently actually working towards our way to becoming employee-owned. So we're currently owned by one of our coworkers, our co-executive directors, and we're working towards at the end of this year becoming employee-owned. So very exciting times at D3. So that's a little bit about us. I want to start today with just spending the next minute to have everybody kind of get on the same page in the same mental space. I know it's a weird time to do this virtual webinar, but I want, to hopefully have you all here with me at the same time. And I want to start off today by thinking about a time when you were uncomfortable about data you read, you heard, someone told you, maybe data you collected, or consuming other people's data, or a time that you heard or read a story where the data ethics weren't clear, or maybe somehow just what they were coming across just made you feel a little uncomfortable about how it was presented, or it was not as transparent as you thought. And really where those data ethics come into play is sometimes you can tell where you're just feeling a little unsure or a little unclear about the information that's being presented. So I just want to give everyone maybe like 15 seconds to try and think about, what have you been reading lately? What have you been watching lately? What have you been talking to people about lately? Where are the stories that you're hearing? And maybe start to think about the ethics behind them, right? So I'm just going to give everybody about 15 seconds. Great. Okay, so now hopefully we're kind of all in our thinking space and thinking about how data ethics can kind of come into play just through the stories you hear, the things you read, things that you hear from people, anything that you kind of consume. There's going to be data ethics involved in that. It's just sometimes we have to, I think, be trained and focus in on the fact that we need to understand how research is produced, so that we can be better stewards of it as we're analyzing it, as we're consuming it. So we're going to walk through in today's webinar a research process and the different things that in terms of data ethics, you want to be thinking about all the way through. So maybe some of you are familiar with this kind of process, back from school, or maybe you work through this in your job, where we have our steps being think, design, collect, analyze, report, and act. And a lot of these steps that I'm going to talk about, they are steps that you would take if you were conducting your own research. But I also want you to take away and think of these steps as these are steps that anyone is doing if they are doing research. And think about the fact that as a data consumer, or information consumer, you're using other people's data all the time, or their reports and things like that. And it's good to be skeptical in terms of what kind of, were they using ethical practices when the creators of that data were being when they were going through their own process. So not only are these steps and these ideas important to you as you conduct your own research, but they're just as important for you as consuming other people's data and information. So with that in mind, and then I just want to reiterate, and I'll try and remind everybody throughout the process that these questions are not questions that we don't think of data ethics. Well, I think too often right now, in general, people think about data ethics in terms of I've created this final product, and now I'm going to think about how I'm going to tell it, or how I'm going to, the lens that I'm going to use to put it in the world. Well, the thing that's important is that we need to be thinking about these things, data ethics, throughout the entire process, not just at the end, which is why we want to walk through these different steps together. So our first step is just stop and think, okay? It's as simple as, have you Googled this, right? You're sitting there, you're thinking, you're on a project team, you have an organization, you have a client or something like that. And, it comes up that you're going to complete this research process, either consuming other people's data or creating your own. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, has this been done before? It's not a hard, difficult question, right? But some of us don't think about it. You also want to know, is this a problem that really needs to be solved, right? So the two examples you're seeing on the screen right now, the top one is a map. We worked with some University of Michigan students to spatially map out, I think over 300 reports that had to do with Detroit. And the goal of this was to understand where are there overlaps, where are there gaps. You can see the darker orange is actually, I want to say it's like, above, it's more than 12 reports that have been written about that area. So you can see, from our example of this, you're seeing that the dark orange have had this overlap of a ton of different reports, whereas there's other areas of Detroit that haven't had this kind of focus on before, right? So the idea of, has this happened before? The other thought is this problem that really needs to be solved? We get a lot of questions, and we kind of go through phases of the requests that we get from people. One of them being about housing, and with housing, there's a lot of people that have reports and want to know and have that information out into the world. But if we just looked around the office for 2 minutes, back when we were in the office, these were all the reports that we found on housing. So as we're in this first stage and we're stopping and thinking about things, we want to think about, is it a good use of time and resources to produce this research, to go through this process? Because a lot of times what we'll find is that it requires a great amount of time and resources and capacity, right? For any of, for reports to be written, for data analysis to happen, for, us to stop and think critically on if this is something that needs to be solved. Whereas if it's already happened, then we can find ways to use other people's work maybe, and, go off of that, where it allows us to to not waste our resources, our capacity. And we kind of look at it through this lens, because a lot of who our clients are and our partners are nonprofits, are small organizations that don't have all the capacity and the bandwidth. They don't have a data analyst on their staff, or they don't, so they're going to find other people's information. Well, that's just as helpful. It doesn't mean that they have to do all the work. We want them to be doing what they do well, right? And what their jobs are, not, trying to create something that's already been created. So we're just at that stop and think point of like, has this already happened? Is this a problem that needs to be solved? Simply Google it, right? And when you're in that think process, you want to think about inclusive design. You want to think about, am I the right person to answer this question? And what I mean by that is you might be educated in this field, you might be educated in the community, but there's always should be that point where you're stopping and thinking before you proceed on, are there other people that need to be in the room? Do I have the best set of skills to produce this body of work? Do I need partners who are better at this, or who are more experienced, or who have a fuller story? And it doesn't necessarily mean you aren't doing the work. It just means bring in other people when it's helpful, when you need that perspective, when you need that oversight, when you need your story to be fuller, right? Sometimes, like, we do a lot of quantitative work at D3. And we're not specialized in qualitative work, right? Those stories that come from the communities, the focus groups, the advisory boards. So what we do is we partner with organizations and companies that do specialize in that and understand the specifics of communities, because that in the end produces a better quality work. If you have those partners, if you have the context and the nuances of the community, if you understand the sensitive data in context of that community, your story is going to be more compelling. Your report's going to be, fuller, has more truth to it, and more ethically produced. One example of like making sure that you're the right person to answer the question, in the city of Detroit, for many years, there'd be a group of various people that came together every year to order the fire trucks for the city. And in this meeting, it would be city staff, administrators, people, and it would also be firefighters, the firefighters who drive the trucks, right? And for many years, they would get together, look at the budget, decide what decisions they need to be made. And one year, the city decided to okay, well, it'd be a lot faster if we just make the decision. So the city staff made the decision and then bought trucks that eventually didn't fit in the firehouses, because each of these firehouses are so uniquely, created, or, they're not all standardized, right? So they're not going to fit the same truck. So simply by having that conversation where they were hoping that, because they didn't have that full meeting and they were hoping to save resources and time, in the end, it actually costs them more, right? Because maybe they weren't the right person to answer that question. So you want to think about inclusive design, how, as much as possible, you want to, the subject matter that you're looking at, the community that you're focusing on, include them as much as possible, because it will make your body of work more ethical and, more robust, and be able to tell a better story. And while you're still in that first initial stage, right, it's a lot to think about, but if you take the time to really think these things through at the beginning, everything else will kind of fall into place. So when you're thinking, it's important to understand, does this research involve people? And this is huge, right? This has a lot of ethical implications. One important part, if it involved people, did you receive informed consent, right? Meaning that person understands what they are participating in, the information they are providing you, and they understand what you're going to do with it. You also want to, did you engage in proper oversight? That's the idea of if you were, focusing on a certain community, do you have some community members to give you that oversight, or an advisory board? We have a bunch of projects that we'll work on that have to do, with certain communities in the neighborhoods and in the city of Detroit, where an advisory board has helped our research become better, right? Because it just provides a little bit of oversight. Sometimes you can be too in the trenches and only focused on, the goal that you're working towards. And when bringing in those other minds and other perspectives, it's going to round out your research in a much better way. When you're working with involving people, it's also important to understand the consent that you get. You need to understand it. Does that individual, is that individual consenting to you providing individual level data, or are they, Or do they understand that you're going to aggregate it up to a larger level, right? Collecting interviews at on a house by house basis, but also when you report out, it's going to be at the neighborhood level, so that there's, kind of protecting that individual identity. If you're analyzing data about people, then you have to make sure that that information is being protected all the way through your research project, not just when it's collected, but when it's designed, analyzed, reported on. You also want to focus on, what am I going to do to protect anonymity? It's very important for people. A lot of data out there has to do with health and safety, right? And that's important. And data like that and projects like that it's really important to maintain that anonymity for the research subject's sake, because these are real people. These are their experiences. These are their lives. And sometimes you just need to take a step and think about the fact of, how am I protecting these individuals? So next, as we move into the design phase of your mental kind of walkthrough of this research process, or that when you're consuming data, you're thinking about other people, how they designed their research process. You want to think about, how are you planning on reporting the data, right? So I was just mentioning, like, those individual interviews, right? That'd be reporting the data on an individual level. Is that something that you can do for that topic, or do you need to be aggregating that data to a larger group, maybe a block group, or a community neighborhood, or a zip code, right? That's one way of protecting the individual data, is just aggregating up to a larger area. So, but this is important to think about as you design your research process, because by the time you get to analyze or collect, you need to have these pieces in place so that you can perform the work that you want to perform. If aggregating the data doesn't actually help you with protecting the people, right? So you can also use suppressing the data. And what that means, really, for one example at D3, is we work with the state of Michigan. We have a data use agreement with the state of Michigan, where they share elevated lead blood levels with us on an individual level. So we get the data set that, has an individual, I believe it's like an ID. And then, if that person, was tested for elevated lead blood levels, if they were elevated, and a lot of this data that we have at least worked with at D3 is for children under 18. So there's a lot of privacy concerns there. One of the things that the data use agreement requires us to do is that if we are reporting the data at an aggregated level, like, for example, like a census tract, or you could think of like a neighborhood block, even smaller. And if there is only been reported that 6 kids were tested for elevated blood levels, or if only 3 kids were actually reported having elevated lead blood levels, then we would suppress the data, meaning we would remove it from our report. Well, we wouldn't have it there, so that what we're trying to do is protect those people's identities from getting out, because that's sensitive, private information. So again, you can think things through on how you're going to aggregate the data, how you're going to suppress the data, if you need to do those things. Also, you want to think about, in your design factor, what happens if you don't get the data you're looking for, right? Because the concern here is that if you don't get the data you're looking for, are you still going to try and prove, or tell the story that you were planning on telling? If it's not backed up by that data, you're not doing ethical research, right? You need to understand that if you can't get the level of data you were looking for, maybe you want data at an individual level and you can only get it at a zip code, right? But then you're producing a report that talks about individuals on a certain street. Okay, it's to make those assumptions and to make those analysis points on those people if the data actually wasn't on the level that you were looking for. So it's a good idea to understand, is this data available at zip code or a city level? And if it is, then maybe you need to pivot and start rethinking about your research question and what you need to get there and what data you need to back it up so that you can produce an ethical body of work. You also want to think about who owns the data. Okay, as you're designing this, how are you keeping the data secure? You don't want to, especially if it's information about or data about humans, human subjects, you need to make sure you're deciding not after you get the data, but even before you ask for the data or before you collect the data, how are you going to keep this data secure? And sometimes there are legal obligations for you to do this. Okay? FERPA, enacted in 1974, protects student education records. We have HIPAA that protects sensitive patient health information. The IRB, or institutional review boards, this is, I want to say it happens in most universities and sometimes outside of universities, where any type of research that has to do with human subjects, this board makes sure that the subjects are voluntarily, they give their consent. They're free from coercion. They understand the risks and benefits from involvement and can withdraw at any time. And this is kind of the idea of getting proper oversight from any of these things, so that you're making sure that you're understanding how to protect these individuals. But also sometimes, there's intention on how you plan to, you intended to use the data, but other people reading your work can always there's always the possibility that they could take it another way, right? So if you have that proper oversight from some of these legal obligations, that's in order to help protect people's safety and security. And if it's not sometimes just the legal obligations, sometimes it's the ethical ones. For example, so what you're seeing on the screen is D3 created a housing information portal. And in this tool, it reports on individual address and parcel information. So you can find out how many blight violations, one parcel or an address received, or who owns the parcel, or when it was foreclosed on, or if it was demolished, or if there are building permits. So this is a tool that produces all that information. And the reason that we created this tool, and it had been a lengthy research process that we were going with a bunch of partners, the goal was for these community development organizations in Detroit, finding out data is a very time consuming, finding the right data is very time consuming. And a lot of them don't have the bandwidth to produce, put together data sets, to match data sets from parcel ID to parcel ID or address to address. So this tool was created with them in mind. As well as we created the tool, we actually continuously asked for feedback from these CDOs, these community development organizations. So we would continuously have that inclusive design of, tell us what's working, tell us what's not. What would you like to see with this tool? What are some of your concerns? And as we were having those conversations with our think step, with our design step, it came up of, this information that we're producing out into the world. Yes, its intended users are those CDOs and nonprofits and residents, but there is a chance that other people will get it, that potentially there could be some people that are not using the data for its intended use. And what are we going to do about that? And as a project team, we had to sit back and kind of think things through of how are we going to protect, the people who live in these, and live in these structures, or the organizations that, are housed in these structures. So what we did was we created just like kind of a pause step where, in order to access the data, you had to create an account. And that account, if you were a CDO or a nonprofit or a resident, it would be automatically approved and you would be able to access the data immediately. If you were someone who worked for a for-profit organization, what we required is for them to tell us a little bit more about how they intended to use the data. And this allowed for a dialogue to understand how they were going to use the data, so that we could make sure that this was being used as it is intended to, right, for those goals. And by doing this, we're just trying to allow the opportunity, like I said, for that dialogue of understanding how to ethically use this data. As we move into the collect phase of the research process, This is where, you're either, like I said before, if it's your research, you're collecting your data. If you're consuming someone else's research or report or body of work, then it's a good idea to start thinking to yourself, how did they collect their data? Were they ensuring the security of the data that had been collected? Were they making sure the quality of the data was being collected? Some of these things, like lessons learned that we've gone through, is one of our projects with the partner organization where we produced a survey online for nonprofits, and we were trying to encourage nonprofits to fill out the survey. And so we were offering incentives, I think in the form of gift cards of some sort. And we came to realize that there were, bots had collected or had identified this survey and were just continuously filling it out, right? So that they would be the ones that, whoever was behind the bots would be the ones to collect that information. So then we had to kind of switch the security of the survey and understand how we could do things differently to avoid situations like that. So it would be real people filling out the survey who were actually part of the nonprofit sector. We want to make sure when you're collecting the data, who's making the decisions about the data and what are those implications. If you're using that inclusive design, you shouldn't have to check yourself so much about, who's making the decisions. But sometimes if we do our research in a vacuum where no one else is there and there's no other, advisory board, or just a double check, another brain in the room, you can start making decisions where you forget in important things of security, of identity, of in consent. And you want to make sure that as you're collecting this data, you're thinking these things through. You also want to understand the implications of data loss in terms of data security, loss as in theft, right? So how all of these things, in order to collect data ethically, you need to be thinking about and asking yourself. Along the same lines, while you're collecting, you need to think of considerations for PII, personally identifiable information. So this is basically like people's names, addresses, social security numbers, phone numbers, email addresses, all of these things that are reported, if they can become, it's easily, people can actually use that information to identify a person out in the real world, if they're able to make a certain combination of putting these factors together, also including combinations of race, gender, birthday, geography, indicator, to actually identify people that the research is about. Right. So if you are working with anything like this, you need to be very careful on protecting that information. One way to do that is simply don't store it, right? Collect the data, have the data for whatever time period you need it for, and then delete it and get rid of it. Also, the other option is, instead of storing this data, by name, make up a coding system. And what you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, we worked, this is kind of one of, it was created in-house. One of my colleagues made a D3 anonymizer, which was what he named the tool. And the goal of this tool was, we had been working with partner organizations to help them understand the needs of young adults in the city who are between 16 and 24, who are neither working or enrolled in school or vocational training program. And it's a population that is hard for people to study and connect with, because they're not involved in the working world, they're not involved in education. So they're really trying to figure out what kind of resources would this community need. But in order to do that, they need some data to help those driven decisions happen, right? As we worked with our partners, they were excited about the possibility of having this understanding of who this demographic was, what were their needs, but nobody was willing to share their information because it was all this private, personally identifiable information. So we created the D3 anonymizer so that it would turn things like, if we had a person in this data set whose name was Erica Powell, born June 11th, 1999, we had a couple different ways that anonymizer would take, the first letter of the first name, and the fourth letter of the first name, and then the last letter of the first name, and make a combination of all these different ways of combining this information. So by the time you got to these like more coded identifiers, you couldn't trace it back to the original participant. And that's a good way of, then if anything actually does happen to your data and it's not as secure as you think it is, there's really no way to identify who these people are. You also want to make sure, if you're like storing this information, who has access to it, either physically or remotely, and then who has permissions to the data. Is there a login system or is it just kind of open to the public? When we're collecting data and it's more community data, we want to think about, does the community have the capacity to store and protect data adequately? It'd be, great intentions to collect all this data for a community as they're making, trying to understand what's happening in their community, trends, events, and then collect all this great data and then hand it over to the community, right? Because you think you're doing the right thing of providing it to them. But do they have the capacity to store and protect it, right? That takes a lot of resources. That takes a lot of, education on that kind of thing that they might not have because it's not their jobs, right? So you want to make sure you're producing it, but also storing it in a way that makes sense for the community and for, the research. If you are storing the information for the community, you want to make sure that they have access to it, right? You want to make the idea that you're not holding all this data behind a door just because you're the one that's able to make it secure. Your organization can make it secure. How's the community? How are you going to have them be involved and have access to it? And then moving into the analyze phase, thinking through, are you cherry picking information? Are you just taking the data points that help prove your point or your argument and ignoring the rest of the data? This is very important to make sure you're not doing, so that you're reporting ethically and making sure that you're not misleading your audience. Easy examples of cherry picking. A nonprofit wants to address some of the issues in the community. They hire 10 experts. 9 of them say affordable housing is your biggest issue. And then one of the experts say, actually, there aren't enough ice cream shops in your neighborhood. And then you turn around and just, write this full report saying there aren't enough ice cream shops. This is what we're going to do to, help solve this problem. That would be cherry picking. You're not taking all of the data set, all of the information and analyzing and reporting on that. You're just taking the point that you wanted to make, right? If, you constantly have a stomach ache, you go to the doctor and the doctor says that your stomach's only going to stop hurting if you stop eating so much guacamole. And you go home and tell your partner, well, my stomach's just going to keep hurting, right? Are you only picking out specific data information or different data points to prove your point? Or are you understanding and including the full body of work? And as you're analyzing your information, this, we talked about at the beginning with inclusive design. We're going to talk about it again at the analyze phase. We talked about in collect. You want to have as much as possible participatory data analysis, because what will allow your work to be most truthful and most compelling and allow for ethical action to take place. You want to understand the context and nuances of a community. You want to make sure that community is able to, if we're talking about a physical community, if we're talking about a group of people not necessarily geographically located together, but a certain demographic, you want to make sure that these people are finding a place in your research to give you feedback, to give you oversight, to do that kind of continuous check on your work. One of the examples that we do with participatory data analysis is that we help manage a group called the Civic User Testing Group, or CUT group, in Detroit. And it's about 500 Detroit residents who basically what happens is we work with a partner, and usually the partner is producing some type of maybe an app. We've worked with the city several times on apps that they're producing to help to identify resources that community members need and residents need, as well as just make sure that the city information is available to residents. So say the city's making a phone app that they want to, produce. What they'll do is they'll create it, and then we'll use those 500 participants and get them to user test this application. And what that does is it provides this continuous feedback loop of the residents who the app is being created for will feel included and allowed to their voice to be heard, so that then the developers of the app or the city can adjust the app so it actually meets the needs that it was intended for. It's one thing to start your research project and put on blinders and just go for exactly what you're thinking that the problem is, right? But if you've done this inclusive design and this participatory data analysis and allow the community or that demographic to be a part of it and kind of check yourself in terms of an advisory board or a qualitative interview or focus groups, in the end, you're going to have a better product, which is kind of what we all want. We want something that is produced of quality, that will be of use to people. And the way to do that, I think, is to not waste resources, bandwidth, capacity. So make sure you're doing it, as ethically and as robustly as you can throughout the entire process. Within the analyze phase, you want to think about implicit bias, right? So all data, well, mostly all data, is produced in some way by a human. So it's a really good idea to always be skeptical of the data that you're consuming or producing, because humans make errors, right? Even computers make errors. So understanding that everything that you're looking at, if it's produced by a human, there's going to be implicit bias in there. And you want to start checking, like, do you have assumptions about your findings even prior to completing the research? Are you just going, like I was talking about in that cherry picking, are you just going for this one answer about the ice cream shops because that's what you believe? Are you paying attention to all the data in your analysis? Are you keeping an open mind and allowing your biases to be challenged? You want to make sure, by checking those biases and by doing that participatory data analysis, you don't want to mislead your audience. You want to produce a body of work that's honest and truthful and helpful. One of the times that this has been, real apparent at D3 is we were working on a project with a bunch of partners to identify the likelihood of neighborhoods in Detroit, how likely they are to experience a transformational change in the near future. So neighborhoods are more likely, some were less likely. And there was one assumption that the project team had when they were looking at the quantitative data, that at certain times there would be less crime in areas where it was not likely for that area to experience transformational change in the near future. And the idea was there'd be less crimes with those, like specifically car break-ins, because the neighborhood wasn't likely to experience transformational change in the near future. Well, what happened in one of those neighborhoods was that a music venue came in and the car break-ins increased. But the car break-ins were actually happening to local residents who had lived there before the music venue, where thieves were thinking these cars belonged to people that were coming into the community because of this music venue, when in essence they weren't. So crime actually increased on a resident level because of that, whereas the project team didn't see that from the quantitative data. The reason that they were able to find out all that information was because they did do several focus groups and qualitative interviews in the neighborhood to kind of check and ground truth that quantitative data research. A real straightforward example of implicit bias that, at least at D3, that we try and always kind of come to head with is during our hiring process. We have a colleague who's not involved in the hiring process who will redact the resumes. So we'll, black out any name, any university name, any location information or location identifier, because that allows us to try and go in it and look at someone's resume and not have it comparable of, one university has a better reputation than another, or so maybe that leads to a better education than another, right? There's all these assumptions and biases that you have. So the goal is to, how can you try and check those as much as possible? And then as you get to this like kind of final report and act phase, there are a lot of things that you want to think about. And then these are all kind of things that we've talked about in these past phases, but it's just the fact of like, once again, you want to stop and think to yourself, like, am I doing this ethically? Is there anything I should be improving on? Things like, is the raw data accessible in the report and application of the data, right? Like, if the raw data is actually available, you want to make sure that that is not, including that PII, it's not going to cause any harm to the, people it's about, or any harm to the community or that group of people. You want to make sure that you're including historical context so that, the user, the audience of the data can get a fuller picture. So that's the idea of sometimes that advisory board, the focus groups, the qualitative interviews, just things that help you round out that data sometimes that the numbers are missing. You want to think to yourself, could this report be used to target a specific group of people negatively? Is this body of work that I'm producing additive? Is it adding value, being producing, that positive effects or those positive steps, or is it being subtractive? Is it taking away from the community? Is it taking away any of that power or that knowledge? Ground truthing data, you're going to be doing that throughout your process if you're doing an ethical research process. You want to think about sorting and sourcing and citing any information that you received throughout your research. And I think where a lot of these come into play is you're hoping by this, if you spent your time and all those other steps thinking through these stages, hopefully by the time you get to your report and get to your act, you have a body of work that was ethically produced, or you're consuming a body of work that you think is ethically produced because you can understand the data ethics that was used during that production of the data or of the report. But as you take those reports and you act on them, you use them to, create initiatives, you use them to get funding. You want to make sure that you're using it in an additive way to, add value to the body of work that's out there. And so a little bit of just recapping some of these questions around a slide that you can read, but they will also be, I believe we're going to try and send them to you as a PDF just to have that check and that takeaway questions. Going through the different phases of that research process being think, design, collect, analyze, and report. So that was a lot of talking, and I think we're open for questions if anyone has any. I really appreciate everyone being here. This is an important topic now and always. So D3 is always honored to have these webinars, and we'd love to chat with you about any questions you have or any ways we think that D3 can be helpful. And as we do any questions, I'm just going to leave it up for if you need to contact us at all. Here's our just email askd3@datadrivendetroit.org or go to our website. So with that, I'm going to stop presenting and see if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, thanks so much for coming to the webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll also mention that D3 does office hours through our Collab Connect. So if you wanted to meet with them one-on-one, I can send out information about that along with the recording and the slide deck. So there's that option as well.